Good evening. Let's call our board meeting to order, and I'm going to ask the treasurer to call the roll.
Ms. Adair?
Present.
President Baker?
Present?
Mr. Brown?
Here.
Vice President Cole?
Here.
Ms. Gibbs?
Here.
Mr. Ragland?
Here.
Ms. Reyes?
Here.
You have a quorum, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to ask the 21st Superintendent of the Columbus City School District to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Good evening, Madam Superintendent.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right, so we are here tonight in a work session format. And so colleagues and those of you who will be addressing the board this evening, we will relax our regular rules of decorum. Let's be a little less formal this evening so perhaps we can move a bit more expeditiously through our business. We do hope to finish by 7 o'clock, and that may help us achieve our goal. Let's have a motion to adopt the agenda as presented.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. Mr. Treasurer?
Ms. Adair?
Yes.
President Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Vice President Cole?
Yes.
Ms. Gibbs?
Yes.
Mr. Ragland?
Yes.
Ms. Reyes?
Yes.
And that motion carried.
Thank you, Mr. Treasurer. And so we're here for one reason, and that is to talk specifically about infrastructure improvements at Dominion and North and Brookhaven. And so I don't think we need a lot more opening comments than that. Dr. Stanford is going to begin the presentation. So thank you, colleagues, for being here on this at this meeting that we called not on our regular schedule. I appreciate it. I know you're all busy, and we're just ending spring break. So thank you again. Thank you, staff, for being here as well. And Dr. Stanford, I'm going to turn the floor over to you if you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, everyone. I am starting tonight's discussion with a statement familiar to all of us. Each student is highly educated, prepared for leadership and service, and empowered for success as a citizen in a global community. As we all know, this is the mission of Columbus City Schools. It is a mission that is deeply rooted in doing everything possible to make sure that our students are knowledgeable, civic-oriented, globally aware, and prepared to achieve their dreams. When we look at the administration's recommendation presented by the Facilities Task Force at the November 7, 2018 board meeting, the board adopted a resolution requiring additional information and research on recommendation number 3. The Facilities Task Force in that recommendation recommended the relocation of Columbus North International grades 9 through 12 to the old Brookhaven site to be co-located with the Columbus Global Academy, and the board also received a recommendation to relocate Dominion Middle School to North on Arcadia, or as we know it now as Columbus North International School, to be co-located with a new middle school language immersion program. The board and the administration held a work session on January the 23rd, 2019, as a follow-up to that resolution adopted on November the 7th, to provide clarification and to address questions from the administration about the board's directive to study and conduct research, further research on recommendation number 3. In advancing the recommendation made by the Facilities Task Force, the board approved a slightly modified recommendation number 3 on February the 20th, 2019. To meet the growing demands for a pre-K through 12th grade language immersion experience and to further support a growing STEAM program at Dominion Middle School. The slightly modified plan approved by the board included maintaining the original proposal to co-locate Columbus North International with the Columbus Global Academy at the Brookhaven site, maintaining the original move of the current Dominion Middle School STEAM program to the North on Arcadia site, but it also identified the current Dominion building for the new Immersion Middle School program instead of it being co-located at the North on Arcadia site. At the Dominion building, the new Immersion Middle School program would be co-located with the Global Academy Middle School, grades 6 through 8. This modified plan adopted by the board presented a wonderful opportunity to create two very strong and unique academic programs in 3 district locations. The plan also presented an opportunity to create vertical alignment with both unique aspects of these 3 programs, academic programs. With the move of Columbus International to the Brookhaven site, we have the opportunity to create a language dual immersion program for students in grades 9 through 12. In this new high school program, students learning a foreign language and students learning English for the first time will be able to learn from each other in a rich and robust language environment. They will also have an opportunity to engage in peer-to-peer learning and explore each other's cultures and traditions through a language-centered approach. This high school experience will be the capstone language opportunity for our students, which is building upon their learning in the district's traditionally strong elementary language immersion programs and to continue their growth in an emerging innovative middle school design, which is a part of this recommendation that capitalizes on the same focused approach as the high school. And again, peer-to-peer learning from students who are trying to learn a second language with those who are trying to learn English through the Global Academy. The middle school modification created the North International and Global Academy High School approach as a standalone program for grades 6 through 8 at the Dominion site. Middle school students seeking to master a foreign language and those seeking to master English will be able to engage in a peer-to-peer learning opportunity similar to the high school student experience at the Brookhaven building. So again, when this is created, students at middle school would have the same type of experience of peer-to-peer learning that they will continue when they go to high school. The student, staff, and leadership of this program will be able to create a language immersion opportunity that provides language development, cultural competency education, and age-appropriate experiences for middle school students. This emerging innovative middle school and high school language immersion experience will fulfill a long overdue pre-K through grade 12 language immersion program that has the potential to be the envy of the state and possibly the nation. The third educational component modified in the February resolution focused on addressing the space utilization and academic needs of the students in the Dominion STEAM program. The STEAM experience created by the Dominion family over the years at its current site is a unique and creative blend of the STEM and art disciplines at the school. And again, STEM is science, technology, engineering, and math. This focus at Dominion Middle School is preparing those students to achieve their dreams and to be available and ready to take on 21st century challenges and careers. At the North site, the students, staff, leadership, and families of Dominion will have the opportunity to create a STEAM-centered student experience that can establish unique learning spaces in the building, like problem-solving innovation rooms, hands-on curiosity labs, which will empower each student in the program to take advantage of the many science, technology, engineering, and math opportunities at several of our high schools and career centers across the district. The immediate threat to our Dominion students in the growth of the STEAM program is the inadequate space at the current site to meet the growing needs of the Clintonville population and the dynamic emerging STEAM curriculum at the school. At this time, I will turn the microphone over to Mr. Alex Trevino to provide an overview of the facility upgrades that will be needed to house these three aligned, dynamic, and creative student-centered academic programs. I want to conclude by summarizing the modified plan adopted in February as the creation of an immersion pathway, the enrichment of an emerging STEAM middle school program, maximization of the usage of each building, and the establishment of a unique opportunity to meet the student-centered purpose of our mission with innovative and creative curricula that vertically aligns and meets the needs of our students. And with that, Mr. Trevino.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. So we'll kind of shift gears and talk a little bit about the kind of bricks and sticks impacts that we've recommended based on what you just heard. So just kind of as an overview, looking at these three specific facilities and their age, not that it is a direct correlation to condition, but in our case, it very often is. So starting with the North High School site and a facility that's 97 years old, Dominion Middle School at 64 years old, and Brookhaven at 56 years old. And understanding that those facilities, Dominion and Brookhaven specifically, have additions that are slightly newer, but those are the ages of the original construction. If we look back at our 2016 facility master plan exercise, Dominion Middle School was graded at that point as our worst condition middle school. The North Building was graded as our second worst condition high school, with Brookhaven only slightly better condition. So looking at infrastructure and deciding what are those key improvements, investments in infrastructure that we should be looking to address. So always starting with that concept of warm, safe, and dry. This is, I think, a concept that even predated our original facility master plan work, where we're looking at those heating, ventilation systems, looking at the roofs, looking at windows or anything else that would allow moisture to infiltrate our buildings, and then any aspect of safety. And so that's always been a priority, and it continues to be so. And then also thinking about the facility master plan. So again, knowing that in 2016, the facility master plan at that time talked about replacing the Dominion building. It also contemplated merging global and international at that time in a new facility. However, the North Building was unallocated, so it did not have any permanent use, although we had always considered that we would continue its use as swing space to allow the facility master plan to continue forward. And so some of these recommendations may fundamentally change some of those assumptions that we made back in 2016. Also very relevant is just the difficulty in getting this work done, because usually our buildings are occupied and we don't get the opportunity to do a year's worth of work while a building is down. So that unique opportunity we will have at North, with a full school year where we can work in that building. Not only can the contractors work more efficiently, we also think we can bring the cost down, at least to some extent, by not having to coordinate quite so many activities while we're operating school. So then just wanted to also recap the current Operation Fix-It work and how this work does and does, it all aligns, but what is covered and what is not covered in Operation Fix-It. So Operation Fix-It, $125 million targeted at our 64 legacy facilities. Some of the work you're going to see outlined later is the exact same type of work that we are already completing under Operation Fix-It, however, not for these particular facilities. So again, remembering that these are buildings that we had recommended for replacement. In Operation Fix-It, we did not recommend and we did not indicate that we would tackle those major deferred maintenance items. And I'll get into the specifics when we address each building. So there is work under Operation Fix-It that is already either complete or will be completed under Operation Fix-It. But that work is, the work you're going to see tonight recommended is above and beyond what is already in Operation Fix-It. So again, the concept of these are mostly infrastructure needs at these buildings that we're looking at. So we look at three main categories. So there's HVAC upgrades and electrical systems. And we look at those two hand in hand because when we're looking at our HVAC systems, at this point, we're oftentimes looking at the option of adding air conditioning. We're at a point where it doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense to make a heating and ventilation upgrade and not simultaneously make the air conditioning investment. And to do that, we need to be able to, usually we have to increase our electrical capacity to support that. So we look at those two together. Learning environment, that is the broadest kind of bucket of things that we look at. And the easiest way I can describe that to you is it is essentially everything that our students, our staff, our parents experience in that building outside of the air conditioning, heating, ventilation. So it's the outside of the building, it's the windows, it's the condition of the paint on the walls, the flooring. It is everything that our customers experience inside that facility. And obviously very impactful to the teaching that's going on in those classrooms. And then site work. And this is a category that is more tailored to each of the sites, and particularly when you look at the high school sites because of their needs to support competitive athletics. So I kind of touched on this earlier, but so just some important notes looking at these specific categories of work. So these are really, particularly the HVAC and electrical systems, these are long-lived assets. So these are real infrastructure improvements to those buildings. They're not cosmetic items. And again, that unique opportunity to be able to do some work, particularly at North in the building while it's not occupied, and just the efficiency that we expect to be able to gain out of this work if it were to be approved to move forward. So now looking specifically at each of the sites. So this is a breakout of some highlights of work recommended for the Brookhaven site. So you're going to see some consistencies across all three buildings, and then you'll see some unique attributes to each as well. So you're going to see the same recommendations for HVAC renovations, including air conditioning, certainly for classrooms at all three facilities, but definitely at Brookhaven. Again, understanding that the building's over 50 years old, largely on its original systems, and they are all beyond anticipated useful life at this point. And then again, that electrical system upgrade that would support the addition of air conditioning in classrooms. And then in the learning environment, it is everything as basic as making sure that we've got fresh coats of paint on walls, which part of that's just making the building look fresh, but part of it's also the opportunity to rebrand. So as we talk about what those academic components are that are going to be important, how do we showcase and make that building feel like home and give that building an identity? And that carries over to the gymnasium. So we're looking at all of the functional aspects, so making sure that our bleachers, our basketball backstops, our scoreboards are working appropriately to be able to support the building, but also looking at refinishing the floors because we know that they have the old school logos fairly permanently painted on them until we refinish them. Looking at a pretty significant investment in exterior masonry and window repairs. So if you're familiar with this building, you'll know that it does have some brick issues, and so we certainly want to be able to address those to make sure we can keep the building dry. Looking at auditorium upgrades, and this is a category you'll see across all three facilities where while the spaces themselves are in fairly good condition, they really lack those features that will increase their value in terms of being able to do a presentation. So think to be able to show a movie or to be able to stream a video. So lots of learning opportunities that if we just had better sound systems, digital graphic capabilities. So really looking at making sure that we can leverage the best out of those spaces in these new programs. Particularly at Brookhaven, again, if you've been in the building, you know that there's been a lot of flooring repairs that so we're not able to match the flooring in that building anymore. So it is in a pretty poor state of disrepair, and so we'd certainly like to be able to address that to some extent. And then specific to this building, there is a former shop wing that the school makes the best use of that they can right now, but it is one area that has not seen a renovation that really desperately needs to. And particularly with the academic programming that we're talking about, it's a real opportunity to do some limited renovations in a building so that we can talk about what those program components are that we can't adequately support in the building as it exists today, and then to be able to make those upgrades to really be able to support that programming. And then the site-specific work, I talked a little bit about the specifics for high school, but particularly because this facility has not operated as a traditional high school for 5 years now. There have been limited to no investments in those athletic facilities. So renovating the running track, the football stadium and football field, softball and baseball fields, tennis courts. So making sure those high school students have the ability to, at their home site, compete in all high school athletics. And then just some various sidewalk, curb, and stair repairs as well. So now moving over to the north site. Again, the same categories for HVAC and electrical as I mentioned previously. Same opportunities with interior painting and rebranding. Similar with the gymnasium. Where you do start to see some differences are on the exterior masonry and the exterior windows. So this building we looked at a little bit differently, both in terms of its condition, but also again that opportunity that the building will be offline for a full year. And also thinking specifically about this building, we will need to have a lot more discussion about the other two facilities in terms of their long-term disposition. But this is a building that I feel pretty confident in saying that we would at some point run it through a full renovation. This is not a building that I would see us demolishing or even disposing of. So with this new relocation of Dominion to this site, looking at taking that opportunity to make sure that we've got the building watertight by making those exterior masonry repairs, but also going ahead and replacing the windows in that facility. And then one other unique aspect to this building is that it is on the National Historic Register. And so the cost sets there are set appropriately to make sure that we can maintain the historic integrity of that building. But similar auditorium upgrades contemplated for this site as well. And then maybe the only thing that's unique on the site is that we've looked at some limited work on the current football field, both to make sure we can take down the current branding on the scoreboard and to be able to have some sort of multi-purpose space on that site, since that really is the only green space on that site. And then looking at Dominion, again, the exact same scope of work contemplated for the HVAC and electrical upgrades. Within the learning environment, I don't think there's anything unique here. This building also has a fair amount of exterior masonry work that really needs to be addressed. And then looking at the site work, on this site it's fairly minimal, but again, just looking at sidewalks and curbs that need some attention. And then I think I didn't highlight this on the other sites, but you can kind of especially see it on this picture, making sure that we're budgeted to replace exterior signage as part of that whole rebranding effort. So then determining the costs of these recommendations. So on the HVAC work, we look at a couple different sources of information. So number one, we have access to a construction database called RS Means. So we look at that database, but at this point we've also, we have 25 of our own HVAC projects through Operation Fix-It under contract. So we've got our own pretty good database that reflects local cost sets. We also have a good variety of buildings that we've tackled. So we've at least taken a quick look to see what sorts of systems we think we would put into these buildings to make sure we've got the cost sets set appropriately that we could actually execute on the work. Looking at the learning environments, we're really looking at our historical data. So I don't know that any of this work is unfamiliar to us. So we've got our own good sets of quotes and cost sets that we've used over the years, and that's really the basis of pulling those numbers together. And then the specific site work is really dependent on the scope of work there. But again, for those big ticket items like the running tracks, field renovations, looking at those databases of RS Means as well as our own historical information. So now here are the cost breakouts per site. So at the Brookhaven site, you see those same three categories and the costs associated with each. And you will notice here that our site work is going to track considerably higher than the other three sites. And again, that's a direct reflection on those athletic facilities. At the North High School site, you're going to notice that that site work drops off pretty considerably. The HVAC number grows quite a bit, but it really grows commensurate with the size of the building. So the North building, I think, is about 25% larger than the Brookhaven building. And then the learning environment number grows quite a bit more as well, and that's really reflecting that window replacement as well as that historic aspect of that masonry repair on this particular building. And then looking at the Dominion building, you'll notice that all of those cost sets drop pretty dramatically from the other two buildings with very little site work at this site. But again, if you look at just overall square footage, this building is just a touch larger, it's just a touch over half the size of Brookhaven. So the numbers are really dropping just commensurate with the size of the buildings. So here you see the total costs rolled up by site as part of our recommendation. And just note that if you add the numbers from the previous slides, on this particular slide, we're also including all of the associated soft costs that we're projecting, as well as contingency to make sure we could actually execute on this work. And that takes us to the financial overview.
Okay, so you've now heard about the academic rationale underlying the board's decision to realign the academic programs at Dominion North and Brookhaven buildings. You've also heard from Alex about the facility upgrades needed to effectuate that realignment. And so we move next to identifying possible sources of funding for those capital improvements. We have three possible sources that I've grouped, I guess, together in three categories. One, a separate specific tax levy to pay for these improvements, taking on debt, and then lastly, looking at spending cash that we have on hand. Let's begin with the option of having a specific tax levy for permanent improvements. We all know what this, we already know what this option is we currently have two permanent improvement levies, or what I'll refer to as PI levies. So we already have two of those levies approved. One is the $500,000 PI levy for the OSFC buildings. It was passed when we started those projects. This PI levy was required by the state as a condition for them co-funding the construction projects beginning, I believe, back in the early 2000s. And as they were outlined in the original facilities master plan. These funds are restricted for use on those buildings. So we can't use these funds for deferred maintenance or renovations or anything like that to the legacy buildings. This is only for the buildings that have been funded, renovated, built through the OSFC program. So it's unavailable for other uses. The second PI levy, which was approved in November of 2016, is designated for life cycle replacement purposes. Life cycle replacement purposes, think school buses. If you want further examples, I'm going to have to ask Maurice and Alex what other life cycle items they have in mind, but typically right now we're looking at school buses. That levy generates approximately $4.4 million per year, and on an ongoing basis, again, it's not only already committed, but it's insufficient to meet the needs here for the Dominion North Brookhaven projects. While we could borrow against that revenue stream, doing so would divert funds from life cycle replacement needs and make meeting those needs financially impossible. As I was told a long time ago, you can only spend your cash balance once, kind of a thing. So since we've already designated those for those life cycle replacements, that makes these unavailable. Typically, in addition, PI levies are best funded for funding capital needs on a pay-as-you-go basis, which was the idea behind this PI levy: generate $4.5 million roughly a year, begin to address those ongoing deferred maintenance needs. And it does not, except for borrowing against those future revenues, as I mentioned, generate enough funds to immediately pay for large capital projects. Now, it's that issue that we specifically addressed by combining levies in November. We combined the PI levy with Operation Fix-It bond issue. The bond issue provided us access to $125 million upfront to kind of jumpstart those projects and to put a pretty good chunk down on addressing deferred capital. And then the $500,000 levy was provided, for annual ongoing funds to address those life cycle replacement needs. Our next option would be to take on debt, and that's typically in the form of a bond issue. And this too, like the PI levy, requires voter approval as well. Let me tell you that there are certain options that we have for what is referred to as unvoted debt. And we've looked at many, many options to try and fund this through borrowing. So since voted issues, I can't talk with my hands tonight. Since voted issues are off the table because of the time frame that we're talking about, looking at all the unvoted issues was another option. I will tell you that those were not, those aren't viable because on an unvoted debt issue, the only source of funds to pay for it is the general fund. So as we get later and I talk about cash and using general fund cash, doing an unvoted debt issue is simply, while you do get to pay for it over time, you're still using general fund monies, and you have the added burden of an interest expense. So unvoted debt is certainly an option, but it's not my recommendation for that reason. Still uses general fund monies and adds an interest expense component. Bond issues, as you know, are typically used for large capital projects and involves issuing debt, the bonds, that is paid off over a longer period of time, say 20 to 30 years, and it spreads the impact of paying for those projects over time. And you think your home mortgage. I've never paid cash for a house, so I always have a mortgage to spread that debt out over time to make it more affordable. And our current example is Operation Fix-It bond issue that has been referenced here earlier. While we could ask voters to approve a new PI levy or bond issue for the Dominion North Brookhaven projects, there's no time to put a levy on the ballot. Since many of these projects begin this summer, planning for those projects that will be executed in 2020, the summer of 2020, that planning has to begin now. And as we know, the academic realignment that has been adopted will begin in part, at least, with next school year, the 2019-2020 school year, which begins in just 4 months. The immediacy of the need for constructing funds takes any of these voter-approved options off the table, and therefore using PI levy or a bond issue is out. This leaves us with our final option, which is cash. Now, we do have capital funds on hand, and they are as follows. The November 16 permanent improvement levy, the new one, it has about $6.5 million currently on hand, as I said, committed to life cycle replacement. The November 16 bond issue, Operation Fix-It, with about $23 million on hand right now. And we're going to be issuing the balance of the 125 to provide more cash because we're going to need that for the next projects. We'll do that here in the fall. That $23 million is likewise committed to the projects publicly identified and shared during the bond issue campaign. So that's committed. There are 2 sale of building funds, which are funded through, hence the name, the sale of buildings. There are 2 of them, and I can best describe the reason why we have 2 is because in the past, maybe a couple of years ago, when the board began to sell some buildings, there was a desire expressed by the board to hold those funds for deferred maintenance. So we made sure that that was separate. There's only a small amount measured in maybe a couple $100,000 in the one fund, and most of the monies are in the more recent fund. But they have a combined total of about $15.4 million, and again, committed to deferred maintenance. Even if you took that and the Operation Fix-It funds, those don't address our overall deferred maintenance. Remember, that was measured in the hundreds of millions of dollars at the time we put the bond issue on the ballot. And again, while the funds from the sale of buildings are not legally restricted to a specific use, if you know, as I said, you can't spend the money twice, so if you spend it over here, you can't spend it over there. So there are already planned, needed deferred maintenance projects that obligate those funds. There are also various funds on the books related to all the prior OSFC projects. That approximates about $16 million. But all of those funds are either obligated or, if any remains unspent as we close out those projects, there's a whole process of closing out the projects with OSFC. There's some interest money in there as well. But any principal monies that remain have to go to the debt service fund because we issued debt to fund them in the first place. So if any of the principal remains, we have to put it into the debt service fund to pay off the debt. And then any interest that's earned on there is due to the state. So it either goes to the debt service fund or it goes back to the state. So that $16 million is either committed or obligated back to the state. Lastly is the $500,000 PI levy related to those same OSFC projects, and I've said those are legally restricted to maintenance on the OSFC buildings, and that's about $49 million currently. So having gone through the borrowing options, having gone through the cash on hand in non-general funds, that leaves us with our general fund to take a look at. Every month, both at FAC and to the board, I report out on a cash position, and we have reported a higher than planned cash balance each one of the months in this fiscal year to date. And we've also explained the sources of those favorable variances, revenues coming in higher, expenditures coming in lower, and we've taken a close look at that. Since we are likely to end the year, in my estimate, about $40 million ahead of plan, we're a little over $50 million ahead of plan at the end of last month. This is the source of funds that I am recommending to the board to use to fund these projects. Yes, it will impact our 5-year forecast, reducing the currently forecasted ending cash balances by $30 million across the board, that meaning in each one of the years. So the graph that I showed the Finance Committee of the cash balances, where it climbs, flattens out, and then declines, it's a simple thing to just move that all down $30 million. It's just a curve shift. But given the urgency of the need, the lack of viable financing options, cash from the general fund, in my opinion, is the best option at this time. And that's why I'm recommending that, did recommend it at FAC, and tonight recommend it to you, the board, at this time. That's my part on the capital funding. I will turn it back to Dr. Stanford.
The last part of the presentation, and it's kind of hard to see, is a decision-making timeline that kind of outlines the way we see the project unfolding. The timeline starts with the November 2018 recommendation from the Facilities Task Force. It then provides additional time from November through February for research by the administration. There's also a recognition that in January, the administration had asked the board to have a work session that outlined the direction given to us to study recommendation further, gave us an opportunity to ask questions and to get clarity on the directive that was in that resolution in November. Then the next stop is that in February of 2019, of course, the board voted to move forward with a modified recommendation in late February. Since the board passed that resolution in late February, the administration has been working on the work that we presented here tonight, in essence, identifying the specific costs, the specific upgrades, and then attaching an estimated cost to those upgrades. And that conversation also involves students, involved faculty members as well, getting a sense from them what are some of the things that they felt were needed as a part of this. As Mr. Bohork has indicated in his part of the presentation, the board is, the administration is looking for a approval of his request to transfer the $30 million out of the general fund into a line item that could be used exclusively for this project. And we are hoping that that decision can be made in May because, as Mr. Bohork and Mr. Trevino have already indicated, there are projects that are on the list to be completed this summer, with the move of, especially with the move of Columbus North International into the Brookhaven site. And so that would be one of the first line of projects to be done, would be at the Brookhaven site, which you see in the middle of the timeline in blue, from May to August of 2019, work at the Brookhaven site. August of 2019, opening of the international program at the Brookhaven site. For the 2019-2020 school year, we would have work on the north site, because with the move of the international program to the Brookhaven site, the north site would be empty, which then provides the opportunity to go in and work on that site for the entire school year of the 1920 school year. Then in June of 2020, we would have the move of the Dominion Middle School into the north site. The the feedback that we received from the principal, and she received this feedback from her faculty and staff, and also from her parents and community, that a mid-year move, which was originally talked about in February, would not work for them, that a end of the school year move over the summer would be their preference. And because as the administration, we have moved away from doing mid-year moves because of how challenging they are, that wasn't a hard one to agree to do as a part of the timeline for this. June through August of 2020, work would begin on the Dominion site. Then August of 2020 would be the opening of the new language immersion middle school at the Dominion site, co-located with the Global Academy 6th through 8th middle school grades from Global Academy. From Global Academy. And then, and I don't have my glasses on, but the last point or entry on the slide would be to indicate that some of this work is going to have to continue on beyond the 2020-2021 school year, because some of these upgrades and even just the process of creating a competitive process to receive proposals on each of these projects, and then actually having design work being done by engineers, and then actually having the construction work being done. A lot of these projects take about a year and a half for them to be completed, especially on the bigger items such as HVAC replacements and upgrades. And so that's kind of the timeline that we have pulled together for this project. And of course, as we go along, we're going to continue to refine and sharpen our pencil on this timeline to make it even more precise as we get further into the project. And with that, that concludes our presentation for this evening.
Thank you, Dr. Stanford and Treasurer Bahorek and Mr. Trevino and Mr. Oldham for the presentation. Colleagues, now is our opportunity to ask questions and provide feedback and input. As you know, I presume we will consider legislation sometime in May to contemplate moving on the recommendation. So tonight we'll ask questions, and who would like to begin? Ms. Gibbs.
Yes. Thank you, President Baker. Thank you to the team. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your thoughtful review. I have a number of questions, so I feel like I'm going to ask 3 or 4 of them and then yield the floor to my colleagues and then come back in the end and ask a few of them. So this question is to the entire team, and I'm just going to ask a few of them and come back and ask the rest as they go along the presentation. My first one is I want to start at Brookhaven and Global at Brookhaven. And my question around the school facility index, or how it fares. If this school is so bad, why do we have kids in it? If the floors and I'm concerned about the condition of the building. And if the condition of this building is so deteriorated, why would we add kids to it and then do work in it? So is this I know the question is because it's aging and it was out, but is 4 months going to be enough time to get all the work done at Brookhaven? Let me start with that question. Is 4 months enough time to get it done?
That's an easy question. So the answer is clearly no. We cannot complete all the work at Brookhaven in 4 months. However, we will have work complete over the summer to make sure we are ready to open for the fall. So there are a couple projects this is where we do have some Operation Fix-It work that is already in planning, and we're planning to bring legislation through before, I believe it'll be at your second board meeting in May. So looking at our security enhancement. So one of the things we've worked with the building principals there to do is to install the secure vestibule, but it will require moving the front door. So if you're familiar with that building, there are kind of 2 entrances that flank the library space. I don't know that either one is really any more attractive than the other, but just kind of people's natural habit is going to take them to the one they always use. So we will be shifting it to the door to the south. So we are able to tackle the basic project under Operation Fix-It. What we're not able to tackle are some of the other things that would really make it work much better as a new entrance. So things like making it handicap accessible. So that's where you'll start to see line items that talk about, we really want to introduce signage, branding to make sure people are going to naturally make it to that front door. We want to be able to, again, put in that new handicap accessible ramp to make sure that all of our parents, all of our visitors can get to that front door and go through that same process. We've also talked, and so you're going to see some line items in here that talk about whether it would make sense to take a portion of the office and move it closer to that front door. Because again, if you're familiar with that building, most of the office is at the north end of that building. So looking at distributing some of the administration in that building and putting at least a portion of it adjacent to that new front door so that we're better able to do visitor and student management inside the facility. So
And it's around, so my question is around equity in the process. If North is going to be empty when all that work is done, and Dominion's going to be empty when all that work is done, why can't we make Brookhaven be empty so all that work is done, so none of those students are in, because the other two sets of students won't be in there when all that construction is done. So why are we going to add kids and construction on top of it, as opposed to swinging Global out while Brookhaven is being done and then swinging them all back so North can be empty? We're one set of kids are going to have banging over their heads and the other two sets are not. So is there a way in terms of timing that we don't disrupt their learning too while they're being acclimated to a new building? It doesn't seem fair that one set of kids is going to have rushed work and not have an empty building when we're going to empty the other buildings to do the work. That's food for thought. I would want you to think about if there's a better way to do that so that each one of these student groups, in the way we swing them, don't have construction over their head, because they still have to learn, they're still going to be tested, there's still going to be a lot of work. And Brookhaven, by the way I've been in it, so I know what you're talking about. It's going to need considerable amount of work, but we're affording the two other school groups uninterrupted time and space to get it done. So I would think that North and Global, who's doing a merger, should have uninterrupted time, or you should be able to have that space empty to get it done maybe quicker without students being in it. That would be a concern for me if I was a parent of why not? Why don't I get space without hammers and jackhammers and, all of that thing being done? Because I don't see this amount of work being done in 4 months to make a time frame. So that's my question about that.
let me make sure I'm clear, and I'm going to flip back to my spreadsheet as well in the presentation to make sure I'm getting the numbers right. So the total recommended improvement at the Brookhaven site is just a little under $11.1 million. And we are not contemplating doing all that work over 4 months. So there are some targeted improvements that we want to be able to complete for the start of the 1920 school year. The rest of this work, we will need to work on a schedule for it. But let's be clear. So our baseline in all of our Operation Fix-It work is to get as much of the work complete over the summer as possible. When there is work that we are not able to complete over the summer, we then resort to second shift work. So we're generally still looking to get as much of the work done over summer, but let's be honest, we frequently have to bookend before or after school, and that work is generally being done on second shift so that we're not having an impact on this school day.
Yeah, because I see the rest of the plan, I see it's very thoughtful, and we're trying to get it done as soon as possible. It's just that the first group that's impacted is being shortchanged in time, and they don't have the benefit of their building being empty for 1 year to get the work and have the stuff done.
And if I can, and definitely correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the idea that we have a swing space that's ready for students to be in without there being additional renovations and upgrades to those buildings, I don't believe we have a facility that will accept students this fall without there being additional work being done to those buildings as well, in terms of swing space. Do we have swing space buildings?
So Global couldn't swing to North?
Pardon me?
So Global couldn't swing to North while the work at Brookhaven was being done? Global fits in North. So if Global swung to north, Brookhaven would be empty to get those renovations done. Food for thought. My second question is, since Dominion is moving to north, will that increase the number of open enrollment slots in the lottery?
Ask that one more time, I'm sorry.
Since Dominion is moving to north and there is more space in north, will it increase the number of open enrollment slots in the lottery?
So as we talked about this during the development of the recommendation, the idea was that we were not going to increase the space or increase the number of seats at Dominion because it's already a large middle school. And so that would have, there would have to be more conversation, we would recommend, by the administration, the board, and the community about how large do we want a Dominion to become, since they're in a building that could accommodate additional space.
How many students are currently enrolled in Dominion? Because it's less than Woodward Park.
Yeah, I believe it's around 700 students. Yeah,
Can
she
you-
said she'll look it up.
Yeah, can you bring us back those numbers? Because it's smaller than Woodward Park's enrollment.
Sure,
And so the
yes.
community, when we talk about using the facility, when they opened up an expansion wing to COS, they increased the number of kids that went to COS because we increased the space. And so the community wants to know, are we going to maintain consistency in that practice?
Well,
And-
but let me interrupt for a second and say, I'm not sure why those decisions were made in the past about COS, but we want to make sure that we're academically strong with decisions that we make in terms of the size of a middle school and what will produce the optimal academic performance by our students in that building.
I agree. I just want to be able to answer the questions at the grocery store.
Sure.
They ask me, I got to ask the question so we can have the answers. Finally, even as we're talking about investing in Brookhaven and in these sites, is it our vision that this is the final location for Global and International? Global has moved 2 or 3 places, and International was created and kind of housed at North. But I think it's important for us to answer the question, is this the final location for both of them? And are we moving them there as a temporary location and we're tweaking the facility at Brookhaven? Or, as you say, we're about to strip this floor and change the logo again. Is this when we come back, is this in our strategic plan where we want the final location for it to be? And as we're voting on investing the dollars, for me, understanding that if not right now, but that decision to be made, is this where it's going to be? COS was moved to McGuffey as a temporary spot and got stuck there, right, for 20 or something years. So my question would be down the line, is this the final location for North International? And if so, there's a different, as we're modifying the building, are we going to come back and invest for this to be the permanent home?
Could I just ask a clarifying question? Definition of final. Please.
Well, I don't know about final, but North International was created to be at North, quite frankly, as an international high school. We're moving its location to merge with Global. Global has been in 2 or 3 different sites. Where was that, Linmore? And was it in one other place? It might have been Linmore, and then we moved it because it outgrew Linmore, so we moved it for space. But we moved reactionary, and we haven't proactively said, this is where you are going to be. And so, as facilities.
Are we talking about 5 years? Are we talking about 10 years? Are we
Listen.
talking about until
No.
all of us die and
No,
move
we're
on?
talking about intention. We're talking about intention. And so because when we closed Brookhaven, we said, okay, we'll keep your trophies up and do all this, because it was just going to be a global site. As we're moving a whole high school into that slot, do we envision them being there for 5 to 10 years when we get ready to redo all their athletic facilities, or do we not put any logo on the floor? I mean, I'm just asking, is this where we're planning to be for the next 5 to 10 years? As we invest dollars in this facility, are we investing dollars for a program that's going to be there for 5 to 10 years? because we've moved people around, and we are looking for the vision of this entire program, which is what necessitated this move. Our parents and our family want to see an intentional focus and commitment to our language immersion. And can they expect that this program is going to be located here for 5 to 10 years? That's not a now question, but it's definitely that's something that should show up in our strategic plan.
You're not looking for an answer specifically to that question this
That's
evening?
not a no.
All right, very good. And now you are yielding the floor temporarily?
Temporarily, you're on the floor.
Thank you. Next was Mr. Ragland.
Thank you, President Baker. I'd like to hear from Dr. Dixon, if that's possible, before we move forward. I just would hope that she could weigh in at least a little bit on what she saw within this, and then allow us to continue our deliberations.
Dr. Dixon, would you care to weigh in?
I love work sessions, right? Because they give us the opportunity to really talk about some of the things that we're thinking. So I want to talk a little bit about what you asked, Shauna. And I think when we're talking facility plans, we can't talk about them in absence of our academic programs, right? So there's a bigger picture. And I think as we continually improve, that we begin to talk about those long-term plans, right? So I think, yes, we may want to say that this school won't move again, but we don't know that some challenges that are not in our control, right? So we see our school district is getting smaller than before. We're thinking about where families are moving to certain size of towns, et cetera. And there are so many different options that are available for students, right? So we see more and more high school students taking classes on college campuses. We see our career and technical education programs that are improving. So to say that this may be the last stop of any school, I don't know if we can say that, right? But I think we are looking at, how we want our students educated. There's going to be some more conversations around that. What does a Columbus graduate looks like? What are the experiences we want our students to have? Where? And, that's a bigger discussion. That's a community discussion. And that's why, we're going to have some partnerships with organizations like Battelle for Kids that will allow us to have those large discussions of what that looks like. But I think for the purposes of what the conversations that the board and the community has had up to today, that this recommendation from the team, it works with our current reality, right? So, and I think that's what we're saying, that now with our current reality and some decisions that we've already made as a board in a community, that if we move forward in this direction, these are some of the things that we're going to have to be reminded of. The costs, the impact, and the transition period, right? Those are going to be critical in any type of move, and that's what we wanted to lay out for you. That's why that timeline is so important that they laid out for you, and the rationales that the team did an excellent job just laying out. These are some of the nuts and bolts. And we won't be, as Alex stated, we won't have students in a building where we're going to hear banging and sawing. We don't want that for our students, and we wouldn't dare put our students in those type of environments. So we're going to make sure that we're going to do this project and do it with integrity and make sure that our students' academic time will be uninterrupted and not a lot of impact to our families. So this plan works with our current reality, but there is going to be continual discussions on what the larger plan looks like for our students and our families forthcoming. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dixon. I'm under the mindset that we're here because there's been some sticker shock, I guess, to the number associated with what we need to execute on the program that we've approved. My question to the administration is around the facilities task force process that was engaged to get to the recommendations. And it seemed to me as if there may be some opportunity within our process to start crunching some numbers on what potential recommendations would look like, so that when the task force, if we have another task force, when the task force presents their recommendations to the administration and to the board, that at least some approximate values could be associated with that document. And I'm not sure if that was a part of the discussion. I looked over the roster, and I know that Mr. Trevino was one serving, as well as Dr. Stanford. I'm wondering if maybe through policy, we could include maybe our budget director or some other folks that could help us inform, at least with some of the early projects that have some consensus that they'll come to the board would look like cost-wise. So if anyone could help me kind of understand that process, and if there is an opportunity for us to maybe do things a little bit different in the future, that would be helpful for me.
I think I'll take the first stab at that. In the years that I've been here, I believe this is like my fourth school closing process with a community-led committee or task force. And that process has always been driven by the board policy for closing schools. And if you go back and revisit that policy, having that sort of calculation is not a part of the policy. It outlines a whole laundry list of different factors that must be taken into consideration. But, you know, cost is not a part of those factors. And if the board, and let me say also, the first school closings that we experienced as a district when I first started in the early 2000s, it was just about closing buildings. It wasn't about creating new programs and moving programs from here to there, consolidating it was just about closing buildings.
Right.
And so cost was not a major consideration of those. These last couple that we have done, they have involved moving programs, consolidating programs, coming up with creative and new, different academic programming. And so I think the part of your question about revisiting the policy and looking at our current reality and looking at how we are able to move forward, those are some things that I think the board can definitely, you know, take a look at and you know, amend the policy if that's the will of the board.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Baker.
Board Member Reyes?
One of my questions is, I noticed that in the renovation proposal for Brookhaven, there's a lot of sports recommendations. What are the current sports that are being utilized by the merging schools? So the current global folks in the global north, because as I recall, I don't think there's a lot of them. That's my first question for the sports. And I understand, I believe from Mr. Clarno, one of the times he talked about, as you add a sport to a high school, there's a petition process. Are we considering that as we think about what we're going to renovate and build? And the third part of that would be, I would hope that that would be the decision as to whether we add a tennis court, as to whether we add a track. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying, I know that there's trends on sports, and we're looking at the demographic of the particular students that are going into this facility. I know that doesn't take a lot of money to put up a soccer area, but from my conversations and well, the students themselves coming to the board, they've talked about soccer, and I didn't see soccer here. Are we considering that space? What would that space look like? So global, international are more about the soccer piece. Doesn't mean baseball is not important, doesn't mean football is not important, or some of the other things. But as we just make those decisions as to what we build, from a sports perspective, I think we need to make that analysis to ensure that we're not renovating a tennis court that's not going to be used. Because I think there's one building that I forget which high school that was, that we had tennis courts and hadn't been used for, a lot of years. So That's not necessarily a question if you don't want to answer, but that doesn't need an answer, but
Before I turn it over to Mr. Oldham, I just wanted to point out that Global is a program and not a school. And so as a
Correct.
program, they have had intramural sports, but not interscholastic sports under the OHSAA rules. And I know one of the questions that I believe we have initially looked at is, is it possible for the Global students to compete on the same team with the international students? I think the answer at the time we looked at it was that the answer was no, because of the way the OHSAA rules are structured. The Global students who want to participate on interscholastic sports currently go to their home assignment school, just like they would be in a lottery school. And so that would continue based on what we've talked about thus far, and unless that has changed, Mr. Oldham. But I think he also wanted to address the second part of your question.
So everything Dr. Stanford spoke about, going back to your homeschool, is correct. But what I wanted to cover is you talked about, are we petitioning for additional sports? Understand that Columbus North International currently has sports, and you talked about soccer, keeping in mind that the Brookhaven site has a football field, which would include soccer goals as well to help accommodate that. Talking about part of our process and discussion and collaboration, we talked to the current staff and athletic director and all the necessary people at the table to talk about what is needed, short-term, long-term. And that's why when Alex talked about the projects, we also have to plan and prioritize those projects. What is needed now? What do we work on moving forward? And there are some sports things that currently active sports at Columbus North International that we need to have up and running. We know they have soccer programs. We know they have softball programs. So we want to get those things up and running. There is a desire from the athletic director also, and has expressed early on that they have a goal to actually embark on tennis. And so that's why tennis is involved in that as well. So again, we are collaborating and looking at those spaces that need to be addressed as we move forward, such as they have a basketball team. And so we do know in the past, one of the things we've heard when Columbus North International initially moved to where they are now was the branding of their school, particularly gym floors. It felt like it never was their site. And so again, we want to be very cognizant of that as we move forward and collaborate and make sure we're addressing those needs.
Another question, Board Member Reyes?
Did you? Okay. I know from a financial perspective, we didn't plan, we can't do a levy or a tax levy. Our question is there grant monies available for the 2020, 2021 perspective? We've got a lot of community partners, a lot of agencies, a lot of organizations, a lot of grants that talk about education. From the National School Board Association conference that we went to, there's a lot of other districts that receive academic grants, building grants, all sorts of other grants. Don't need an answer. I'm just wondering, there's money out there that we possibly are not looking at that could help offset some of these expenses. Can we put somebody on the lookout for that? And I know from the NSBA conference that we went to, there was a lot of different types of grants out there that other districts have applied for, even for sports. So, not necessarily a question. As we are, and I think this is going to be no, but I'm going to ask it anyways. We have our technical school students, our masons, our masonry students, our electricians. I know from the electrician perspective, it's probably a no, but our masons and some of our other HVAC students, is there an opportunity as we're building and producing that some of our students get experience in being involved in helping build some of these sites and alongside some of the contractors that we're going to be hiring? Possibility. I know there's probably legality you have to look at, but I think it'd be great. There's 3 buildings.
It's something that we could definitely look into with Ms. Cleary Potts, who's in charge of our career tech and adult education programs. I know when we had the old OSFC project. I know we had interns working at the Smoot-Elford Company as a part of those projects, and students got the opportunity, you know, to be a part of projects that were going on at that time. Couple of things that you know jump out is that you know working on these construction sites can be hazardous. Correct. And so you know I'm not sure what the liability or the legal issues that may be a part of a program like this, but I think it's definitely something that can be looked into. Yes.
Because I bet you our students could probably make a heck of a lot better sign than that sign we're looking at right now. I bet you our Fort Hays students would love to take some paint and make that so much prettier than what it looks like right now. And I am sure we have Harmony Project or some organization out there that can supply us with the paint. Clintonville Go Public has funding that I'm sure, and they've raised some funding and might be already committed, but I'm sure they would have some opinion on if they were asked to say, hey, well, you know, if you want this, what would this look like? Because they do fundraising. So I'm sure they would be willing, they may be willing to invest in Dominion and North. So just.
Yeah, let me jump in quick. So we would certainly need to have some pretty lengthy discussion on the trade side of any opportunities. I think it's possible. It's just not something we have done to date. So we'd have to figure out logistics, but kind of to your earlier point, so there are some really easy touch points that I think would make a lot of sense. So like when we start talking about branding, so I have no idea even what we're going to name some of these programs, much less what mascots or school colors or, so I think there's all sorts of ways we can involve students, and absolutely it would be a lost opportunity not to take advantage.
And I watch City Year, and I've watched our students in some of our promotional items where the kids are painting murals on our own buildings. So why get a painter and pay them that money when one of our kids would love to see their artwork on our own buildings? And last question, I'll yield. Will the whole North High School be utilized with the move of that particular population? It's a rather large school. Will the whole building be utilized, or will only part of the building be utilized, or do we know yet?
I think we still have to have more conversation about that. But one of the things that is intriguing and exciting about the Dominion Middle School in that site, as we've said, is that Dominion is a STEAM program, and so the ability to create unique STEAM-related spaces is there now. We talked a little bit about project-based learning labs, being able to create innovation labs. Robotic labs is another one that kind of came up in conversation with the folks from with the principal from Dominion as being a possibility. Partnering with the Ohio State University to maybe have some space in the school, or the Point at Otterbein. They've got a great project going on at Otterbein, and so there might be an ability to create a partnership with them to have dedicated space where we actually have peer-like students from the universities there inside the building in a dedicated type of way and in a systemic type of way, working with our students on these type of ideas. And so those are some of the type of discussions that can happen over the next year in terms of how that space will be utilized at the North High School site. Anything you want to add?
So just kind of a couple hard data points. So when you look at those two buildings, that being Dominion and North stacked against each other, the current Dominion building is 85,600 square feet. The North building is more than 100,000 square feet more, so it's 188,000 square feet. Now, you do have to take into account that I know that the floor plan of North is less efficient.
Yep.
So you've got a very strictly double-loaded corridor at Dominion, whereas at North you have courtyards and single-loaded corridors. So there's just some general inefficiency, but certainly the student capacity at the North building is far larger than Dominion. So.
And the performing arts capabilities at North also, with this being a STEAM program, will lend itself well for them to really, build a robust performing arts program as well to go along with the STEM focus that they have.
That's the main reason I'm asking, because I'm just making up numbers, so maybe you already have the numbers. If you have 40 classrooms in Dominion and you have 80 classrooms at North, is there an opportunity to break down walls, or is there an opportunity that we're talking about savings and how do we use buildings? Is the top floor not going to be used, only the bottom floor? Doesn't mean you don't renovate the whole building, but, is that going to be somewhere where you have deferred cost of a whole building, that those savings can be utilized to update and upgrade a different building? So that's the purpose of my question.
So I can answer that one. So in the numbers you see for the north building, we don't contemplate any reprogramming. Like that's the terminology we would generally use for taking down walls and making a space far different than it is today. The only space that we put in a line item for is at the Brookhaven building, and really thinking because that building still has that old shop wing, and if you've been in it, it really truly is the worst part of that building. Particularly the old auto shop space that has literally no finishes in it. It's literally a concrete floor, no ceiling, and it's old heating system. So at the north building, to answer your question directly, we didn't put anything in there for that. So I don't necessarily have any place to reduce costs by taking that out right now. That is work that personally I would only recommend that we tackle if we were going to do a comprehensive renovation of that entire building. You start to get into so many of the systems. I can tell you from my experience with that vintage of buildings, we have a lot of shafts that run vertically through the building, so you start running into fire code issues where you start to open up penetrations that run through floors and smoke infiltration. It can be difficult if you're not looking at the whole building comprehensively.
So we can add auto shop to the Brookhaven International Immersion Program, just saying. Go ahead. There's a shop already there, just saying. One of them.
Colleagues, we had originally said that we would conclude this meeting at 7. It doesn't appear as though we're going to conclude this meeting at 7. Do we need a motion, or can we just have consensus that we set a time for 7:30? Do we need a motion for that?
Motion to.
You can't do that, you just keep.
For a work session?
I think you just keep going.
Okay. Colleagues, so is there any objection to continuing
No.
at this time? Okay.
7:30 is good.
All right.
7:30 is okay, but not another extension.
Okay, colleagues, let's shoot for
I agree, Mr.
7:30.
Brown.
All right, very good. 7:30 is our target.
Several of us have obligations.
Yes. Board Member Adair.
Okay, so I have a question about kind of more how the budget's working here. So we are, like, for example, I'm looking at the north estimates, and I know, like, probably the audience doesn't have all this because it wasn't in your slides. You've broken it down, what exactly goes in each cost estimate. So for the learning environment, you have everything, like you mentioned, from, like, the basketball court refinish to drinking fountains to furniture. So I'm wondering if these are prioritized in any way. And in North specifically, because you mentioned the STEAM program, I don't see anything here around science, like new labs or anything like that. If they wanted those things, would that then be an additional request later?
So let me answer the first question first. So I would say no, there is no prioritization, with the only exception being that, so when you look at that HVAC and the electrical components, those two have to be taken together. It's kind of all or nothing there. And then, so one of the reasons why we didn't put any other significant upgrades in at the north building, and perhaps this wouldn't meet the needs there, but so right now that building has full science lab upgrades for high school, so it has a lot of infrastructure in place. What we have experienced so far is that typically where there is need, it really is for equipment. So furnishings and equipment to be able to support those kinds of programs. And there certainly is there are some budget numbers here that could support that kind of work.
Thank you. And for just transparency, as we move through these budget items, so for example, when the new chairlift would go in, Would those then, Treasurer, does the board approve those individually, or is it kind of a, a purchase, when we approve the full budget amount to move the money? I'm not being articulate right now.
Well, you have till 7:30.
Are we approving, when we are asked to approve the transfer over of the money, are we being asked to approve each one of these items individually, or will the board then be asked at a later point to approve contracts and expenses for these specific items?
The latter.
Okay.
You'll do the funding separate from the approval of contracts.
And so that means at any point, there may be some circumstances where even though we have earmarked the money, we may not actually decide to go forward with a request or a budget item. That could happen.
As in all construction projects, that is correct.
Right.
When you're dealing, I'm not a construction person, but
could come high,
I used to own a home in Clintonville, and I opened up a wall once, and surprise,
Didn't you hear him? You need to watch the wiring.
Yeah.
I just want to be clear for transparency, right? Because once we start doing some of this stuff, there could be costs that are above, and that might mean we might not be able to do everything here, right? So these are flexible, these are your estimates right now, but costs could change, right?
Once you get your architect.
Once you get the architect and design and all of that.
Yep.
So I would say, yes, that is an accurate statement. So one of the things that we're watching really closely right now, and it's not unique to us, is the job market is hot. The construction market is even hotter still, and we are certainly having trouble finding contractors even to complete our current Operation Fix-It work. So yes, I mean, there is risk with all construction projects. Right now, with the budget numbers we put forward, I feel pretty good that we can execute on the work that you see in front of you. But as you indicated, with every construction project, there's always risk.
And my last question involves then the placement of these schools in either the current Operation Fix-It facilities plan or future ones. If this new stuff for them right now then changes what they get in the future and when.
So again, this is just me speaking right now. This is something we really do need to look at across the district. Our facility master plan and prioritization of projects. Like I mentioned earlier, 2 of those buildings were amongst the worst condition buildings when we did our last report out. So this level of work will certainly change that against its peer buildings. So I would certainly recommend that these buildings come down in that priority list. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't still run them through the facility master plan at some point, but I wouldn't see them being the next buildings up, as people would say. But certainly there will still be plenty of work in these buildings that we would like to achieve at some point.
Thank you, Alex.
Vice President Cole?
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you so much for the presentation outlining the importance of the academic side of this, where those gains are possibly made, and then explaining in some pretty good detail here what the facilities aspects of this is, especially in terms of cost. So with that, I have a few questions. The first is how much has, and you alluded to this earlier in your presentation, that there's an accruing cost of deferred maintenance. This is a wonderful transition, in fact, from the question just asked by Board Member Adair. Where are we seeing, do you have any idea of how much accrued cost has happened for our deferred maintenance needs since 2016?
I don't have a number that I could give you that I would necessarily have any role.
Is that a number that we could identify at some point in time soon?
Sure. So just to clarify, you're looking for the degradation, like how much
So,
additional accrued?
In 2013, we said we had a deferred maintenance cost. We estimated it at just under $300 million. I'd like to know how much that needle has moved since then and now.
President Baker, I would say in general, just at a very high level, we're all aware of reports out there about general inflation. You hear that from, the Federal Reserve reports and what's going on in the general economy. And so considering that since 2016, using a rough number, inflation hasn't been rampant, but it hasn't been zero. So you're looking at 1.5% to 2% generally in inflation over that period of time. So that alone, if you were at, say, just 300 million, and you've gone 17, 18, you're 3 years down the road, you've got 2% more, 2% more, 2% more, just from inflation. I have no idea. I don't know how I would ever, that's the financial side. The material, geez, we've waited 3 more years to do those repairs. Are they worse? The degradation part, I can't do that. But just in general, as time passes, things will generally get a little bit more expensive just due to inflation.
All right, so just general number crunching, we're looking at 6% additional on top of the 300 million that we talked about in 2016, just from your side of it, not considering resources, labor, capital, that kind of thing.
And also life cycle replacement items that's coming to its end of useful life. One good example would be, it's not even a building, if you just look even at our buses. And we know as we push the can down the road of deferred maintenance costs, or just replacing those buses, we know the maintenance costs go up. It's the same concept when you have our building, when you're talking about the mechanicals and you're talking about the life cycle replacements. You're going to have life cycle replacement of spanning out of its time that should be replaced, so that those costs is incurred. I mean, the simple example, if you look at our district, just look at simple bleachers in our district, in gyms. That's a life cycle replacement cost that's not always in that category or funded, so that helps raise the cost as well.
I understand. Thank you. I'm just trying to get an idea here that the costs are accruing, irrespective of whether the building is in use or empty. Costs are accruing for deferred maintenance.
Let me add to our treasurer's earlier comments. So there's certainly the inflation aspect of kind of the costs or the value of the currently deferred work. Industry standard would say to expect that your building condition deteriorates by about 2% every year. So you're looking at the anticipated useful life of a facility of 50 years. And to get to that, you're degrading 2% every year. So that's in addition if you aren't continually funding that 2% to kind of maintain a static condition. Does that make sense?
Got you.
2% every year degradation, and then the value of the inflation for
So
what's
now we're
not
looking at 12% total, but thank you. Thank you. Okay, the other question, Mr. President, is, Mr. Trevino, can you explain the capital improvements already made at Brookhaven and Dominion either during or prior to Project Fix-It?
So I know at the Brookhaven building, that facility received a new roof as part of the Warm, Safe, and Dry initiative. I don't have the number in front of me, but that would probably be like a 2006 project. So the roof on that building is fairly new. So that's one of the reasons why we did not put any funds in it for that particular project as part of Operation Fix-It. Specifically for Brookhaven. So one of the Operation Fix-It initiatives is to replace the fire alarm system in every one of our multi-story buildings. So this building, Brookhaven, as well as Dominion, were already scheduled for that fire alarm replacement.
What about a roof on Brookhaven? I'm sorry. But but that was before Project Fix-It, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
So that was part of I think that was part of the 2002 bond issue that funded
Gotcha.
the first 2 segments of the facility master plan. But while we're on roofs, so the Dominion building has already had its roof replaced as part of Operation Fix-It. That was one of our very first projects because we were having a pretty significant issue there with water intrusion in the building.
Okay, thank you for that.
Mr. Cole?
Yes.
Your question didn't go to this, but the Brookhaven site in partnership with the Columbus Metropolitan Library also has some renovations done to the library space at the Brookhaven site, correct?
Okay.
Correct, and so we kind of touched on it earlier with the north building, but both of those buildings have also had science lab upgrades as part of, I think it was the 2008 bond issue.
I thank you. My question and final is, well, partially, is how are we addressing equity throughout the entire district? How are we dealing with equity throughout the entire district in terms of this, capital improvements across the board to all of our buildings? You made a statement that this $30 million is something that will, drop that line item just slightly. But again, how is this addressing the issue of equity throughout the entire district with our focus on safe, warm, and dry?
So difficult question, because obviously there are disparities in the building. I mean, the best way I can answer that question is that we really have to keep focused on that facility master plan, because I know people gravitate to whether their building has air conditioning or not, but frankly, there are so many other needs in the buildings as well. And they're everything from when you walk in the front door, are we accessible? You can look at any aspect of it, but there are so many other needs in the facilities.
Absolutely. Going back to the fact that the facilities master plan is the only way to really ensure equitable distribution of resources to our buildings and the capital improvement needs. I believe when the program was first started, it was to be completed by 2017, right? And so here we are 2 years beyond that completion point, and we only have 46 buildings that have gone through either been renovated or built new through the Facilities Master Plan program. So we still have about roughly 60 buildings out there that have not gone through that program. So when we talk about equity, the Facilities Master Plan, when we talk about equity for capital improvements, the Facilities Master Plan is the only way to ensure that and get that program back up and running again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Brown, and then we'll go back to Ms. Gibbs.
That's right. Definitely not after 7:30.
Mr. Brown, just in case you...
And I don't have a lot of questions, in part because they've been well covered already this evening and previously as well. But I did appreciate the presentation. It really brought things together in a way and laid it out in a way that will help for understanding for all of us. A couple of the questions that I have, and let me talk about the equity first because it was just touched on. My understanding of that concept of equity is that the buildings will get and the programs will get what each of them need, and it's not going to be looked at and shouldn't be looked at based on here's what others got, so we want the same. And I've heard bits and pieces of that, and I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And if these programs and these buildings need certain things, then we're going to do what's needed, as opposed to, just because somebody else has air conditioning, there may be some buildings that are just not, that we can't afford it, or we can't do it for other reasons. If I'm wrong about that with any of you or anybody else, please speak up and let me know. Jennifer Adair brought up a couple of topics that piqued my interest. One is the disability work that needs to be done in these buildings. Obviously, it needs to be done anywhere we're doing any work. And I know that there's some talk about where a lift may need to be put in, or because the buildings age, and configuration design, that there aren't a lot of options about how to do that. But are we looking to best practices, current best practices, wherever we can, and that instead of putting in, lifts or long ramps retrofitted to what's there, to actually taking steps out of the way? And, because nobody really needs to have steps if there's an accessible way to a building without that. So those concepts, are you looking at that as you look at these buildings and then elsewhere?
Yeah, so I appreciate the call out because I neglected to bring that up as part of the larger points for each of the buildings. So you will see various line items that address accessibility concerns in each of the buildings. The biggest investment is recommended at the north building, and I'll kind of circle back to that. But so looking at things as basic as our drinking fountains, so oftentimes they are not ADA compliant. Looking at our signage, I know everybody immediately tends to go to physical mobility disabilities, but signage is a big shortcoming across the district. So making sure our signage is compliant. Looking at general restrooms, so with these vintage buildings, we cannot make everything accessible, but I do think it's our obligation to make sure there are accessible restrooms in the facility. So making sure that we have either visitor or family restrooms and staff restrooms and student restrooms throughout a building so that we can serve everybody. Now, when you look specifically at the Dominion and Brookhaven building, again, thinking about those facilities really needing to run through a complete renovation at some point, we did not recommend putting in elevators. We can make reasonable accommodation on the ground floor of those buildings because they are on one level. So when we do need to make those accommodations, it will require us to adapt staff and where we place classes and offices or whatever's required, but we can make that work in those existing facilities. But to circle back to the north building, the reason you see a line item in that facility for lifts, if you're familiar with that building, it is unfortunate that 100 years ago they thought it was acceptable to have a cafeteria and a gymnasium that are not on the main level of the rest of the building. So it's a 3-story building, it has an elevator. However, you cannot get to either the cafeteria or the gymnasium space. And there is no way to make a reasonable accommodation in that space. So we thought it was the right time to make the investment to make sure that anybody who comes into that facility, we can provide full services, including access to those 2 spaces. So that's the reason specifically for that recommendation.
And thank you, I appreciate it, and it's something that's always been important to me, and I want us to keep our eyes on all of those things. I also learned, and part of this was with a role with respect to the new Common Pleas Courthouse. There are many things that can be done that are ADA compliant, and we have to do that. But there are sometimes things that we can do that make common sense on top of that to make it easier, not just for those with physical disabilities or other disabilities, but make it easier for everybody. And we should be watching for those opportunities as well. The other item that Jenna, there's comments about risk and questions about risk reminded me. And that was a conversation that we very briefly touched on at one time recently. And that is, are these projects the kind of projects that might be suitable for construction manager at risk? And is that something, especially with the time frame in which we need to get things to happen, does that help allow the process to move more quickly? And
So what I can tell you is, so we've had to think very quickly in terms of what we think the best options are. And right now, our recommendation is to move forward with a design build. So we're certainly looking at design or construction reform and looking at some of the newer methods that we have available to us. But particularly because we have a lot of experience very recently. So we've used design build for all of our recent HVAC, or I shouldn't say all, most of our recent HVAC projects. Frankly, from a speed perspective, we have all of our contracts in place. We have we've made the upfront investment with outside counsel to make sure we have all those contracts in place. We have the process pretty well nailed down. I am comfortable and I'm confident that we can get this work done using design build.
all right, thank you. For the future, really do want to take a look at the opportunities that CM at risk would potentially provide us. And finally is a very small question in the scheme of things, but as I was reading this, excuse me, as I was reading the draft earlier, I realized that we often talk, and the report mentions legacy buildings. We've got 67, I believe was the number that was referenced. Can you define legacy building? What exactly do we mean by that?
So this is one of the areas where sometimes our facility speak doesn't exactly align with academic speak. So we'll refer to operating at 112 facilities. And so when we talk about 46 FMP or facility master plan buildings, those are the buildings that we have raised local funds and brought in the state funds to completely renovate or replace those buildings. And then those other 66 buildings are what we refer to as the legacy facilities. So any district academic facility which has not gone through the state's facility master plan process. That is how we would define a legacy building. So just to give you one example that is kind of somewhere in between. So the Woodcrest building was renovated by the district, I believe, back in 2000, but it was done outside of the state's program. And so if you're familiar with the building, it does not have a separate gym and cafeteria. So there are a few aspects that don't exactly align with the state's current requirements. So that is still a legacy building, even though it is our newest legacy facility.
Yeah. Okay, and it's not black and white, and it's not by reference to any other outside standard or definition.
No, sir. It's kind of a nice term to talk about older, sometimes antiquated facilities and systems.
You and I are legacy people here.
I understand that, and I was thinking exactly the same thing, and, you know, Alex is trying to avoid referencing that in the process.
And I believe that, thank you, Mr. Brown. I think that brings us to Ms. Gibbs.
Yes, thank you. So let's do a bit of speed dating very quickly. Stan, on page 26, when we talk about the sale of building funds, and there's 15.4 million, and you say they are committed, they have been committed to what?
Those have been designated as committed to deferred maintenance projects, part of the almost 300 million that we had talked about back in 2016.
Okay. And have we expended them all, or this is what's left in that?
That was as maybe, I think I ran that report a month ago.
Okay.
So it's I don't want to say close enough, as in that's not I'm not being glib, but that's what's in there now, yeah.
Okay. And to Board Member Brown's conversation on equity and its definition, I think that's the continual work of this board. And we talk about what we need. And in this plan, I'm trying to figure out what exactly do we need and what do people want. So I think I echo some of the sentiments of my board members. This is a plan of saying, this is everything that's needed, we want it all done. If we had to prioritize this list of what we needed for academics and learning versus what we could defer to the next bond program, I would be interested to see what that looks like. Could you bring us back a option 2 of, this is everything we need to get started, and we think we could move this a bit later, and this can go into the OSFC process when we pass the bond or levy. I would want to see that option to say, we know this is, all of it needs to be done, but does all of this need to be done right now? And can the state pick up a portion of the cost of it if we moved it to a later time, to the part around, and some of the I know work is in the LFI, but I would want to see a prioritized option to some of these to see if some of those dollars could be moved. I think I'm okay with the Dominion. I understand the Dominion work. But when we're talking about some of the other pieces, I would want to see you come back, or if you had a conversation, and if you came back and said, no, that'd be fine, but I would want to see a different,
Madam Yeah,
Come back
the team is already
with
working on
with
that
a
now.
priority list, and if you were able to identify additional funding or resources to reduce the expense on the general fund by turning over every rock, I would want to see that. But I'm 100% committed to anything that increases accessibility for wheelchair, for visual, for hearing. So our students with hearing disabilities, which we don't talk about a lot, that start at Huey A.G. Bell, which is very much close to all of these buildings, when they have ocular implants, are we also thinking about putting in those systems? Because when we built Huey, it's amazing, how they automatically dial in and tune. But as we're thinking about accessibility, I want us to think about all of them, from braille to ramps to, as you say, signage. Is it big enough? Can we see it? Is it lit to address all of our physical challenges?
Again, Mr. Trevino, jump in if I'm misstating anything. But I think one of the things we have to take note of when we look at the way Mr. Trevino and his team have broken down each of these upgrades. We got HVAC and electrical systems, then we have learning environment, and then we have specific site work, right? When you look at that work, all of that work is deemed to be needed for the academic program at that school. Now, will this $30 million be spent in 1 year? No. It's going to be spread out over a couple of years, maybe even 3 years, because of what we described earlier in terms of the whole contracting process and then being able to actually conduct construction at these sites during the summer, after hours, on weekends, so on and so forth. So this project will have some things done this summer before students went into the Brookhaven building. Then there would be work that would begin on the north site that would go on for that entire year. And then as the Dominion site is vacated by the Dominion School in 2021, then that work on the Dominion site could commence. But again, it won't be done, even at Dominion, it wouldn't be done in 1 year. There would be additional work that would have to be done. So the second part of your question in terms of, if there are changes and how that would be impacted by potential money from the state or new grants, new funding opportunities, I'm sure that we would all be looking for those opportunities and take advantage of them if they became available. And I'm not sure if we're in the middle of an upgrade project and, if the board decided to put a bond package on and the bond package was approved and we got back into the FMP process, I'm not sure how that would all play out in terms of work that's already being done and how it would impact how OFCC would look at that as a part of the state FMP program.
Okay.
So it's complicated. But I think the easy answer is that, yes, this is a 2 to 3 year project where there will be work done throughout that 2 to 3 years. The money would not all be spent in 1 year. And that, yes, we will look for alternative funding sources if we can identify them or if new ones become available.
Okay. So my next question, thank you for that, Dr. Stanford, but help me understand just two more things and I'll be done here. One, can you bring back to us, these are requests, not the questions, but can you bring back to us the current enrollment for all of our middle schools? So we have that data. But as we're investing and we're upgrading, are we looking at a technology when we're talking about learning environment? As we're bringing these new people in the buildings and we're doing stuff, will they be able to do distant learning, online learning from colleges? That's a flip of a wire. I don't know if you're thinking about that, but I want to put that on the radar, because if we're making $30 million worth of renovations, I want to see an increase of capacity of our learning opportunities and those options. Can we Skype into Japan? Can we do a class for Franklin University? Are we thinking about locating Columbus State or Ohio Dominican on one of our campuses or Capital, the same way Reynoldsburg High School has a Yeah, they have a Columbus State branch on their campus. These buildings have significant amount, not Dominion, but North and Brookhaven have a significant amount of land mass. We're never going to get that type of space again. So I know it's nowhere close to being sold. But as we're looking about putting this much money in, are we also I want to put the technology piece on that radar? Because at $11 million, my other question, I sent this by email, so I don't know if you got my answers yet. How much did it cost us to renovate East, South, Lyndon McKinley in comparison to what we're proposing to do a slight renovation to Brookhaven? Because if it's only an extra $7 or $8 more, should we do just a total blowout renovation of the Brookhaven site? But I don't know that without having those numbers side by side. North, I understand, is going to take probably a lot more money, remembering how it's built like South and East. I understand that's a much higher cost, but I would want to see how much in comparison for just a full renovation for Brookhaven as opposed to this $11 million. Just, you can bring that cost back. And the final question you can bring back is, in the design build, have we heard feedback from our LEDE vendors about how well they're working with our design build primes? Have we heard feedback from all of our vendors on how well this process has worked for everybody, not just the people who win the first contract? And can you bring back how many of the LEDE people have been a part of this bid and this cost quote breakdown? Those are my questions. Done?
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues. And Mr. Oldham, is your hand up? I beg your pardon.
Just for clarity, Ms. Gibbs, you should bring back, and you helped with the paper, how many have been the cost of this bid for LEDs? Which bid are you speaking on? You talking about?
Well, we have, we didn't talk about it, but it says, we have a breakdown of the recommended infrastructure investments, and there are costs associated with them. And so my question would be, are these costs based on bids we already had, work we've already done, and does this reflect any bids from LEDE vendors? And in the design build process that we've already used, if you're recommending us to continue with that process, what has the feedback been from our LEDE community on that process? We've heard things from them in the past. Have we improved or have we addressed their concerns about that process? And do we have conversation or, what has happened since they've raised those concerns?
So that I'm clear, I want to separate.
Okay,
the
yeah,
paper.
separate. Yes.
And I think the question that I'm hearing you state is, in the design bid projects we have, what has the LED participation look like?
And what has their feedback been about it?
Okay.
Because I know you hold regular conversations so that we can stay on top of good neighbors, or we keep people invested. Just, have we heard any feedback about the process of the work that we've done? Okay. And they are separate questions. You're right, Mr. Odom.
And if I could real quickly take the board back to slide number 18, where Mr. Trevino gave an overview of how the cost estimates were derived for each of the big broad categories. And as you will see, some of that was based on our previous experience in the contracting work that we have done prior to this.
And so that's what my question, what is the feedback from our LEDE
Exactly.
community on our previous and similar work?
Yep.
Yeah. I know what we did, but how do people feel about it?
So the earlier question, I can't answer relative to the costs that are recommended now versus the cost of replacement, like to run a building through that full renovation. Because one thing I would prefer not to do is to go back and look at our previous renovations, just because inflation has moved along. So unless we adjust those values, they don't necessarily reflect today's reality. But so just to look at the Brookhaven example specifically. So that facility is 157,378 square feet. I know that the state is in the process of updating their cost sets for this year, but they're, at least as of last month, their most recent cost sets they have online are $255 a square foot. So that would put a replacement for Brookhaven at about $40.1 million versus the recommendation you see in front of you, which is just over $11 million.
Yeah, thank you. I still want to see the numbers, just
Sure.
Just to know, but I know it's a big number, but it's almost 1/4 of the number.
Correct.
And so our last question will go to Mr. Brown.
At the risk of getting a bit beyond the 7:30, and I really apologize.
Is this a motion to adjourn?
It's going to be.
Very well then, carry on.
I think it needs to be said, there have been quite a few requests for information, for studies, for some of which may be very time-consuming, prioritizing everything, and it may not have value. Those aren't coming from the board as a whole. And I think that administration needs to be reminded, perhaps, or just, it's a matter of policy and operations, that some of those may not make sense, and, you're free to respond in that way. Unless it's the board as a whole that makes those requests. So with that comment, I move to adjourn.
Yes, the chair will entertain that motion. However, I'll say what I always say, and that is, it is not for any of us to assign value to another's question or request. It is at the discretion of the superintendent whether or not she is responsive to the request. If she feels that she cannot be or should not be, she will let the board know that. And so that is entirely at her discretion, and she'll discuss that with me as she sees fit. So we have a motion. Is there a second? Second. Moved and seconded. Mr. Treasurer?
President Baker?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Vice President Cole?
Yes.
Ms. Gibbs?
No.
Mr. Ragland?
Yes.
Ms. Reyes?
Yes.
Ms. Adair?
Yes.
That motion carried.
We stand adjourned. Colleagues and staff, I thank you. Have a good night.